In the Ethiopian Bible, there is a book that most Christians around the world never see in their own scriptures. When Apollo 12 deliberately sent part of its lunar module crashing into the moon, instruments left on the surface recorded vibrations that continued far longer than most people would expect from a dead, airless world. The impact became one of those details that never completely disappeared from lunar folklore. The moon seemed to resonate for hours. Much later, that experiment would be folded into a far older mystery, one reaching back more than 2,000 years to a book excluded from most modern Bibles. The Book of Enoch contains a long astronomical section concerned with the movements of the sun, stars, seasons, and the moon. Most readers encounter it as ancient cosmology, yet a more unsettling reading begins with the way Enoch describes the heavens: ordered paths, assigned guardians, gates, measured cycles, and beings responsible for keeping the system in motion. The language can feel less devotional than procedural. That distinction gives the lunar passages their power. The text attributed to Enoch does not present the moon as an object wandering freely through the sky. It belongs to an organized system governed by strict timing. Light arrives in measured portions. Its visible face changes according to a schedule. Certain beings are assigned to celestial functions. Uriel, one of the most important angels in the work, serves as Enoch's guide through the machinery of heaven. Read symbolically, it is religious cosmology. Read literally, the same description becomes much harder to explain. Because Enoch is eventually taken beyond observation, he is shown how the system works from within. And in that interpretation, the moon stops looking like a distant light and begins to resemble a structure with an interior. The survival of Enoch is almost as unusual as the ideas inside it. The work disappeared from most Western Christian traditions, yet it remained scripture within the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, preserved in Geyer's manuscripts while Europe knew it mostly through scattered references. For generations, that isolation made the book easy to dismiss as a late religious curiosity. Then the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered near Qumran in 1947. Among the fragments were multiple copies of Enochic material written in Aramaic. Parts of the astronomical tradition were suddenly anchored much further back in time than many casual readers realized. At least some of these ideas had circulated in Jewish communities centuries before Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire. Fragments identified with the astronomical material, including pieces associated with 4Q28 and 4Q209, became especially important because they could be compared against the later Ethiopian tradition. The section usually called the Astronomical Book, spanning roughly chapters 72 through 82, is obsessed with order. Days are counted, movements are divided into portions, openings in the heavens are described as gates. Celestial bodies emerge, change position, and follow appointed routes. Within the tradition preserved around these passages, the moon follows one of the most carefully described cycles. Its visible light begins small, increases in measured stages, reaches fullness, then diminishes through the same sequence in reverse. The reference tradition assigns fractions to that process, presenting lunar change as regulated rather than random. Ancient people obviously observed lunar phases. They did not need telescopes to know the moon grows bright and then fades. The strange part is the framework placed around that observation. Enoch is not simply told when the moon will change. He is shown who is responsible for the order, and Uriel is the one who leads him toward it. The central mystery begins with a word that appears again and again in Enochic cosmology: gates. In the lunar account, the moon's changing appearance is connected to controlled openings, through which light is received and released. The phase cycle becomes less like light falling across a stone sphere and more like a measured transfer. That image grows increasingly mechanical. Enoch is shown what are described as storehouses, reserves associated with the moon's light. Some are full while others are empty, and their condition changes as the lunar month advances. A symbolic reading makes sense within ancient religion. Heaven is ordered, and light obeys divine law. The literal reading is much less comfortable. A structure receiving light, holding it, releasing it in stages, and changing according to a fixed schedule begins to resemble a machine. The account then moves downward. Enoch describes successive descents toward a lower chamber, connected to what the story calls the Wheel of the Moon. The language evokes depth, levels beneath levels, reached through something understood as a downward passage or shaft. At the lowest point, 4 named beings are associated with the mechanism: Barkiel, Zachiel, Araziel, and Samael. Their functions are not described like those of kings or worshippers. They are tied to specific parts of the operation. One is connected with the side where light enters. Another oversees its release. Another is associated with the wheel. The last keeps the moon's path in balance. The wheel itself is said to move with a constant roar compared to rushing water. That small detail changes the atmosphere completely. Enoch is no longer standing beneath a quiet, heavenly light. He is inside a place with motion, sound, depth, and assigned workers. Nothing in the scene requires those workers to speak. They do not deliver long prophecies. They occupy stations. The ancient writer presents them with the calmness of someone recording a system already functioning before he arrived. That is why modern literal readings of the passage focus less on the word angel and more on what the beings are doing. The most unusual part of the lunar account is how little room it leaves for randomness. The text divides the moon's visible light into portions and follows those portions across the month. In the version behind the modern mystery, the first stage begins with roughly 1/7 of the moon's light visible. By about the 7th day, half has appeared. Around the 14th day, the moon reaches fullness. The process then reverses as the light is released in declining measures. Ancient observers were capable of tracking lunar phases with great accuracy. Civilizations long before Enoch built calendars around them, but Enoch's description does something different with that knowledge. The cycle is framed as a regulated process occurring within a larger celestial administration. The moon obeys what the text calls a law or appointed order, and the beings associated with it are described as participants in keeping that order intact. That turns a calendar into a system. The moon does not simply brighten. Its light is allotted. It does not simply move. Its course is maintained. The distinction becomes important when Enoch is taken downward toward the wheel because the schedule above and the mechanism below appear to belong to the same design. The phases seen from Earth are the visible result. The machinery, in the literal reading, is hidden inside. The artificial moon interpretation depends heavily on manuscript wording. The Ge'ez copies preserved in Ethiopia became crucial because they contain a much fuller Book of Enoch than Western scholars possessed for centuries. The later recovery of Aramaic fragments from Qumran allowed portions of that tradition to be compared across languages and across enormous stretches of time. Those comparisons opened arguments over which lines were ancient, which may have been added, and how unusual terms should be understood. One disputed tradition is especially important. It describes the moon as a vessel fashioned by hands not of earth, while beings within it remain at their posts. If that wording belongs to an early form of the text, the artificial interpretation becomes difficult to avoid. A vessel made by non-human hands is far more specific than a poetic description of moonlight. If the wording entered the tradition later, then one of the strongest pieces of the mystery collapses. The tradition connects that disputed sentence with both Ethiopian material and an older Qumran fragment, while also describing disagreement among translators over whether it represents original wording or a copyist's addition. That dispute sits at the center of the story because neither possibility is small. A later insertion would show how dramatically ancient cosmology could be reshaped by generations of copying. An early reading would mean somebody was describing the moon with language that sounds disturbingly manufactured. The history surrounding Enoch only made the argument more combustible. James Bruce, the Scottish traveller, carried J.A.'s copies of Enoch out of Ethiopia in the 18th century, bringing the complete work back into European scholarly view. One manuscript eventually reached the Bodleian Library at Oxford. When English translations appeared, the astronomical chapters were often treated as difficult remnants of an obsolete cosmology. At the same time, the book's absence from most Christian canons encouraged a different story, that certain descriptions of heaven had been deliberately suppressed. The historical record establishes that Enoch did not become part of most Christian biblical canons. The claim that church leaders removed it specifically to conceal the moon passages is much harder to establish from the material alone. Still, the suspicion persisted because the full text survived somewhere Western Christianity had little control over: Ethiopia. Behind monastery walls, the book kept saying what Europe had stopped reading. A popular suppression narrative points to the Council of Laodicea in the 4th century and to later church writers who rejected books outside the developing canon. In that version of events, Enoch's descriptions of heavenly beings and cosmic architecture were considered too dangerous or too strange for ordinary believers. The surviving history is less clean than that story suggests. Enoch's exclusion cannot be reduced to a single documented decision about the moon. Canon formation unfolded differently across Christian communities, which is exactly why Ethiopia matters so much. One church preserved the book, while others did not. That difference later acquired a sinister meaning in modern retellings. If Western churches abandoned Enoch while an isolated tradition kept it intact, then every unusual passage could be read as something that had escaped removal, rather than something merely forgotten. By the early 20th century, translators such as R.H. Charles had made Enoch accessible again to English readers. The astronomical material remained among its strangest portions, because it preserved a universe organized through gates, fixed courses, and beings assigned to the lights of heaven. A later episode adds another layer of uncertainty. According to an account attached to the modern Enoch mystery, an uncatalogued Dead Sea Scroll fragment appeared in a private sale in 2003. It was said to contain lines from the astronomical tradition describing watchers who remained at their stations inside a vessel associated with the night. Photographs were reportedly circulated briefly among people interested in ancient manuscripts. Then, the fragment moved into a private collection. Its current location is unknown. The story names scholars who allegedly saw the images and considered the handwriting consistent with ancient Qumran material. But without the physical fragment available for examination, the claim cannot be treated like an authenticated Dead Sea Scroll. That uncertainty is precisely why the episode became so powerful. If the fragment was genuine, it might preserve another version of the same unsettling idea: beings stationed inside a celestial vessel. If it was misidentified, altered, or falsely attributed, then its disappearance protects the claim from ever being properly tested. There is no satisfying conclusion either way. The object that could settle the question is the object nobody can examine. And while arguments about manuscripts continued on Earth, 20th century scientists were learning that the moon itself was far stranger internally than it appears from the night sky. The Apollo missions transformed the moon from a distant object into a measured world. Seismometers recorded how impacts traveled through the lunar interior. Gravity measurements exposed uneven concentrations of mass beneath parts of the surface. Precise orbital observations revealed motions far more complicated than a simple circle around Earth. After deliberate impacts, vibrations continued for extended periods. In alternative interpretations, the famous description that the moon rang became evidence of large empty regions beneath the crust. Long-lasting vibration does not establish artificial chambers. Yet once Enoch's descending levels and storehouses are placed beside that data, the comparison becomes difficult for believers in the theory to ignore. Then there are the mascons, dense regions beneath portions of the moon detected through their gravitational pull. Their existence proves the moon's hidden mass is distributed unevenly. The artificial moon theory goes much further, treating those concentrations as possible elements of an engineered internal structure. The measurements themselves do not establish that conclusion. They simply provide another physical oddity onto which the ancient description can be mapped. The orbital comparison is stranger still. Enoch's astronomical system describes a moon whose path is kept in balance through an ordered mechanism. Modern astronomy knows that the moon's orbit slowly changes orientation over a cycle lasting roughly 8.85 years. In the literal interpretation, that long-term movement becomes the modern equivalent of the adjustment Enoch attributes to the wheel and its operators. The gap between those two ideas is enormous. One is ancient cosmological language, the other is measured celestial mechanics. No physical evidence proves they describe the same thing. Yet, the resemblance is the reason the story survives. Because if the ancient language is pushed all the way to its literal meaning, Uriel was not guiding Enoch through a vision. He was escorting him through a facility. The gates become entrances. The storehouses become internal chambers. The wheel becomes a control mechanism. And the beings at their stations become operators responsible for a system older than recorded history.